Hey everyone, congratulations. You are now halfway through the summer term. We are entering week 4 and we are starting Dracula this week. So during week 1 and 2, we read Jane Austen's 1815 novel Emma, and then last week we read Dickens' 1843 novella A Christmas Carol. We are now in the second half of the term, leaping to the end of the 19th century to discuss works that were written in the 1890s. This context of the 1890s is especially important for each of the works that we read for different reasons for each work. But today I want to specifically discuss the ways that the 1890s represented some national anxiety, some decaying ideals, and the spirit of experimentalism that grew out of that. After covering that context, I also want to very briefly discuss what vampire stories are and what they traditionally do. That's something that we'll build off of, though, throughout the week significantly. So last week we discussed the Victorian era as a time of change and reform. We addressed the ways that industrialization and crowded cities cause increased problems for England's working class, as well as an increased visibility of class inequality. So this led to many political reform movements, actual reform laws. These laws would create, these reform movements would create laws against child labor under certain ages, eventually mandatory education for all children. There'd also be divorce laws that would change throughout the 19th century, giving women more rights after divorce to money and to custodialship of their own children. And then also all of this led to an increased discourse around the idea of middle class morality as a backbone of a stable society. So, while at times this emphasis on morality was out of concern for the disenfranchised of England, many times it was discriminatory and restrictive. Several laws were passed throughout the 19th century aiming to protect female sex workers and close brothels, but some of these became very discriminatory against the working class women themselves, the women who were working as sex workers. And then in 1885, an amendment latched onto one of these laws, which allowed the state to more broadly prosecute and punish men for acts of homosexuality. Kind of got snuck into the law at the last minute, but had very significant impact for men, especially in British society during the late 19th and early 20th century. Other fallouts of this middle class morality, temperance movements, though born out of concern for the women and the children who often suffered when men became drunk, violent, and irresponsible with money. They weren't widely popular, these temperance movements, definitely not enough to pass into law, because they seemed to target such a central part of British social life. And then censorship laws were also very popular throughout the 19th century, and they limited what could be published and what could be put on stage. So in the 1890s, disenchantment with religion, empire, and the British class system continued to grow. Frustrations with the restrictions of Victorian morality also grew. For many, this frustration came to a head when the playwright and author Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for acts of gross indecency, the wide term used for sexual behavior between men through the Labouchere 1885 amendment. On top of this were added anxieties about the move into the 20th century. Britain, well, at the end of the 19th century, was maintaining its large empire. It was also slowly seeing America and Germany grow as empires and global economics leaders themselves. And then also on top of this, just the population of Britain was changing for many reasons having to do with colonialism, but also because many Jews were fleeing Eastern Europe at this time, and they began to immigrate to Britain starting around 1880s. So the landscape of Britain was changing as well as its position in the world. And many just didn't know what England would look like or what it would mean to be British moving into the 1900s. Several different literary movements emerged during this time period, but one of the major themes across 19th century European literature was decadence. Decadence was a movement that rejected moralizing literature for literature or in preference of literature that focused instead on the senses. Oscar Wilde, in the preface of The Picture of Dorian Gray, would say, quote, "They are the elect, to whom beautiful things mean only beauty," unquote. The decadent movement sought to resituate art away from the lessons about right and wrong, instead focus on anything that could stir up new sensations without judging those sensations as good or bad. These sensations could come from anywhere, even from sources of anxiety or from iconoclast treatments of subject. One of the central texts of the decadent movement was Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, which is translated as The Flowers of Evil. It's important in many different ways, and in other classes you may have even heard it discussed, but what I think is important to our current conversation is its subject matter. By writing about eroticism and death and even a poem about a vampire, it rejected the idea that only morally good and happy things could be art and could produce kind of strong sensations within an individual, maybe even that the dark stuff produced them even more so. I mention this context because I think it's important to understanding just why Stoker's Dracula became such a sensation when it was published in the 1890s. The figure of the vampire had existed for a couple centuries in Eastern European folklore, and other British writers had written about vampires before the 1890s. But at the end of the century, anxieties about the changing face of England, cultural decay, a shifting moral center, all of this joined with an increasing interest in the sensual and the erotic in literature and art. This created the perfect context for a vampire novel's success. Vampires represent many things, and I think that we see multiple levels of representation in Dracula. That's something that I'm excited to talk about this week. In this week's supplementary reading, for example, I want us to consider the ways that vampires can represent anxieties about invasion and colonization. But before we delve into those specifics, I want to speak broadly to the question, very briefly, of what is a vampire and what does a vampire story do? So to say this might seem like stating the obvious, it probably is, but it's important to note that vampires begin as humans, can pass as humans, and drink human blood to exist. I say this not because I don't think this knowledge is commonplace in American culture. It's something that I'm sure everybody knows. But I think that it's important to note the connection between human identities, human problems, and the figure of the vampire. Vampire stories, at their core, address anxieties about human anxiety, human identity, and human experiences. In psychoanalysis, the term abject is used to communicate the horror experienced at a breakdown in someone's sense of self when it faces something like a vampire that challenges the divisions between self and other. The vampire, for example, is that figure that in many ways represents who we are and makes us, kind of forces us to reconfigure or, re-examine our own anxieties in ways that might be extremely uncomfortable. So in the case of some of the vampire stories that I'm familiar with, I know that human characters are forced to confront extreme versions of human problems like addiction, consumerism, isolation, violence, just to name a few. And I think that these are some of the things that we'll talk about in Dracula that I hope we can talk about a little bit in the adaptations we see of Dracula, but also in the supplementary reading that I will provide and in our Zoom class. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all there. I gave you a very long lecture, if I remember, last week, so this one's a little bit shorter. Answer the question in response to this in the discussion forum. And I will look forward to seeing you all to watch some Dracula and vampire story adaptations on Wednesday. Have a good week, everyone. Bye!